Hello everyone. Today, we will learn the 9 most optimal steps to solving LSAT logical reasoning weekend questions developed after analyzing more than 10,000 plus logical reasoning problems over 10 years of LSAT classroom instruction and tutoring. Alright, I will give you 30 seconds to read and try the problem first. Okay, so step 1 is to enclose argument in a rectangle to remind yourself that it is a closed universe you are dealing with. Think of each LSAT argument as a state-specific legal matter. Just as the personal injury laws of Mississippi cannot determine the outcome of a California car accident, your outside knowledge cannot determine the outcome of an LSAT question. You must rely exclusively on facts and opinions presented in the particular argument presented before you to find correct answer. Alright, so, let's do just that, and we have now completed step 1, draw box. Before moving on to step 2, please pat yourself on the back as half of the battle has already been won. For ancient Chinese wisdom says, a good beginning is half the battle. Now, step 2 is to highlight the 4 parts of an LSAT argument in their respective colors. Start with identifying the main conclusion in green, followed by background in beige, premise in blue, and subsidiary conclusion in gray. Highlight premise, conclusion indicators such as since and therefore, and transition. Words such as but and however in orange. But always remember that LSAT deliberately introduces subsidiary conclusions with main conclusion indicators such as thus and therefore to check whether you truly understand what's going on. For example, in this argument, thus in the last sentence actually introduces a subsidiary conclusion and not the main conclusion, which appears in the second sentence without any fanfare. You would thus have gotten this question wrong if you had automatically assumed the last sentence were the main conclusion due to it being prefaced by thus. With that awareness, let's do the highlighting. I'd first begin by highlighting the last sentence from the program to take effect in green, then highlight. This is encouraging evidence that, in orange, because it is a premise, conclusion indicating phrase. In this case, the preceding sentence becomes premise because the phrase explicitly refers to it as evidence. This is encouraging evidence that also introduces what particular opinion the premise aims to support, which thereby becomes the main conclusion. Now, additionally highlight however after last year, because it is a background indicating word, however is signaling a rebuttal is coming up, so the preceding sentence cannot be premised since it is about to be disowned, discounted by the argument. So it is background and should be highlighted in beige. Now, let's move on to step 3, which is gisting, summarizing entire argument in one sentence purely in your own words to ensure that you have actually understood it. Let's do it sentence by sentence. Sentence 1 reads, high school students who feel that they are not succeeding in school often drop out before graduating and go to work. Rewritten purely in my own words. To me it reads, at public learning places these days, failing kids frequently say, screw this. Stop attending, and find employment instead to make dough. Second sentence reads, last year, however, the city's high school dropout rate was significantly lower than the previous year's rate. Rewritten purely in my own words, to me it reads, but in 2025, the number of kids saying that relative to those who continued attending has plunged with more awe compared to 2024. Third sentence reads, this is encouraging evidence that the program instituted 2 years ago to improve the morale of high school students has begun to take effect to reduce dropouts. Rewritten purely in my own words. To me, it reads, that gives us hope and serves as strong proof for the effectiveness of the Let's Read the Bible First Thing in the Morning campaign launched in 2023 to boost self-love, esteem. Finally, the entire argument rewritten purely in my own words, to me, reads, That the ratio of kids quitting to not quitting has gone down in 2026 is pretty strong proof that the Let's Read the Bible first thing in the morning campaign launched in 2024 to raise kids' spirit is actually working. Alright, so we have completed step 3 gisting now. Let's move on to step 4, describe in abstract, which is describing argument in terms of variables x, y, and z, and their relationships to one another. Here, we can think of it as x has gone down. Y was instituted 2 years ago. So y most likely caused x to go down, where x is the dropout rate and y the morale-boosting program. Seen this way, the argument's logic does not appear so infallible anymore. In fact, remember that there are 2 Scooby-Doobious leaps in logic that permeate most LSAT arguments involving causality. The first dubious leap in logic is going from correlation A and B occur together to causation A or B caused the other. Just because A and B occurred at the same time does not mean one necessarily caused the other. Both could have been caused by a third variable, or it could have simply been a coincidence. The second dubious leap in logic is going from sequence A happened before B to causation A, therefore must have caused B. Just because A happens before B does not necessarily mean A caused B. It could be the opposite, or they could be completely unrelated to each other. Here, the argument is engaging in the second by assuming that the program merely being instituted 2 years ago is strong proof that it was the cause for the decrease in dropout rate, when other factors such as bad economy could have been at play. Alright, we have now completed step 4, describe in the abstract. Let's now move on to step 5, find the shift. Remember that the original sign of LSAT is circular reasoning, when premise and conclusions say the same thing without any independent support being provided. To avoid committing this logical fallacy, an LSAT argument must say something different in its main conclusion than what it said in its premise and subsidiary conclusion. This is where the shift occurs. A subtle change in scope, certainty, or quantity that is all too often taken for granted. Here, the shift occurs from the premise that the dropout rate was significantly lower to the conclusion that the program has begun to take effect. Premise was about the dropout rate decreasing, which could be due to a whole host of factors, while the main conclusion talks about the effectiveness of the morale-boosting program, which may have contributed to the decrease, but just as likely not. Being woke to this systematic leap in logic exposes the hasty generalization that is the bread and butter of most LSAT arguments. The Milgram shock experiment carried out at Yale University in 1961 demonstrated the blind faith Homo sapiens often place in authority figures even when it is blatantly wrong to do so, much to their chagrin. That same blind faith is placed in LSAT arguments by most test takers, especially the silent majority, who were never properly taught how to read critically as pupils. They read an argument and automatically assume it is sound due to LSAT being an authority figure, like assuming someone who went to Princeton is most likely gifted in one way or another, even before meeting them simply because, well, they went to Princeton. Identifying the shift and other steps are all designed to dispel such uncritical acceptance in order to see in an LSAT argument what we often choose to ignore out of convenience or love imperfection. All right, we are done with step 5, find the shift. Let's now move on to step 6, think part the whole, whose purpose is to remind you that an argument's premises can necessarily present only part of the whole picture. There are many factors to consider, and you're presented only with a partial view of the whole. Here, whether the morale-boosting program actually caused the dropout rate to decrease requires considering a whole lot of factors, of which the program's date of institution is but one part of many. Yet, argument takes that as encouraging evidence for claiming actual responsibility has begun to take effect for the decrease in dropout rate. And therein lies argument's vulnerability. It makes a claim about a whole from limited evidence concerning but one part of many issues too. Consider. Alright, let's now move on to step 7, frame cause and effect. Remember, LSAT's 2 unique assumptions regarding cause and effect. First is exclusivity. the idea of monogamy can love only one person for life. In other words, the given cause is always assumed to be the only possible cause. Second is universality, the idea that if it worked for Becky, then it should for Tommy as well. In other words, the given cause is always assumed to work across different contexts. Remembering those two principles, frame the argument into cause and effect. There is no hard-set rule in how to go about identifying what is each, as it varies from argument to argument. There are, however, two kinds of cause and effect relationships that appear in LSAT logical reasoning. First is direct X gives Y. When argument says out loud X caused Y, premise often becomes cause and main conclusion, effect. The second is inferential X, so Y where it is not that X actually caused Y, but on the basis of X happening. Argument infers, reading between the lines to figure out what most likely happened, or could happen, effect. Remember that weaken is about raising the possibility of alternative causes that could threaten the sense of exclusivity. For example, discovering your partner is on Tinder or Grindr. Here, cause is the morale-boosting program, and effect the decrease in dropout rate. It is also helpful to identify between cause or effect, which is opinion, and which fact. Here, the suggestion that the program was the cause for the decrease in dropout rate is an opinion, while the decrease in dropout rate is a fact. It is undeniable that the dropout rate decreased. What is up for debate is what actually caused that decrease. It could be due to the morale-boosting program, or it could have been due to any of unmentioned possibilities, such as the economy being in a recession or potential employers moving to other regions for lower tax. But all of that doesn't matter here, because LSAT arguments always assume the given cause is the only possible cause, even if they don't explicitly say so. Any additional fact or consideration that hints at the possibility of alternative cause thereby weakens argument. So here, any answer choice that suggests something else besides the morale-boosting program could be at play in decreasing the dropout rate would weaken. Alright, let's move on to step 8. Remember the 5 ways to weaken. Recall LSATs to unique cause and effect principles at play. First is exclusivity, the default assumption that the given cause is the only possible cause. Second is universality, the default assumption that the given cause should lead to the effect across different contexts involving different people. Each of the following 5 ways to weaken LSAT cause and effect casts doubt on the functionality of LSATs to unique operating principles of LSAT cause and effect. The first weakening scenario is to suggest alternative cause. Here, an alternative cause would be something like the local economy entered recession, so not many jobs were available, which suggests that something else besides the given cause, the moral-boosting program, could have caused the drop in dropout rate. The second weakening scenario is show that cause is there, but effect isn't. This type of weakener usually involves a different context, people for whom the given cause was applied, but the predicted effect failed to materialize. So here, a correct answer of this type might mention how a similar morale-boosting program was instituted at a school in a different city, but the dropout rate failed to decrease, threatening the assumption of universality that what works for one person ought to work for another individual. Otherwise, the original happening might just be an outlier. The third weakening scenario is to show effect is there, but the cause isn't. Similar to the second weakening scenario, this type of weakener will mention how the supposed cause and effect relationship failed to materialize in a different context involving different people. So it might mention how a decrease in dropout rate was reported in a nearby city, but there was no morale-boosting program instituted. The fourth weakening scenario is to show that the cause and effect are reversed. For this particular question, a weakener of this type might mention how it was after the dropout rate decreased when the morale-boosting program was instituted, perhaps, to cheer up those who wanted to leave but couldn't due to lack of jobs. The fourth weakening scenario is to show that the cause and effect are reversed. For this particular question, a weakener of this type might mention how it was after the dropout rate decreased when the morale-boosting program was instituted, perhaps, to cheer up those who wanted to leave but couldn't due to lack of jobs. Such a scenario would threaten the assumption of exclusivity, because if it weren't the morale-boosting program that caused the decrease in dropout rate, then clearly something else, an alternative cause, was at play. The fifth weakening scenario is to show problems with data. Perhaps the survey came with a loaded question, for example, have you stopped beating your wife? Or the instruments used to collect evidence malfunctioned. In the US legal system, tainted evidence, for example, evidence obtained unlawfully, can trigger mistrials. Similarly, any additional facts suggesting data used by argument is tainted would disqualify the making of any valid inference evidence-based opinion. Here, weakener number 5 might mention how the drop in dropouts was merely an illusion propped up by statistical errors. Alright folks, we are now done with step 8. Remember 5 ways to weaken. Let's now move on to the final step. Step 9. Eliminate by Holy Trinity. Recall that every LSAT incorrect answer essentially does the same thing. It commits hubris by exaggerating or otherwise misrepresenting what argument originally said in scope. Certainty or quantity. The Holy Trinity of LSAT. Scope is about the who and the what. Argument sample could have been restricted to interviewing Ivy League students, but an incorrect answer will apply the findings to the average college student in America. Certainty is the level of confidence placed in main conclusion, which usually oscillates from could to must. Quantity concerns whether it is none, some, most, or all. Focusing on these 3 dimensions will allow early cutting of incorrect answers without having to read until the end, which will conserve energy and attention. Let's try it out, beginning with E. E. The anti-dropout program was primarily aimed at OK cut. We can stop reading here because stating the program's primary goal cannot help us determine if the program actually caused the decrease in dropout rate. It is akin to restating how you had a burning desire to be thin at the start of the yoga diet program. Okay, so what? LSAT correct answers tend to be actual happenings, not just merely a thought or feeling that exists only in the ether. So the biggest problem with E is that nothing actually happens. It is informational and not actual. Okay, let's move on to D. DI high schools in the city established placement officers to assist. Stop. You can cut here because nothing actually happens. Similar to ED states, the aim of a certain program meant to help graduates. But was the aim actually achieved? We don't know, so the scope is off in that we need an actual fact, something actually happened that could help us determine if the morale-boosting program was really the only factor per the assumption of exclusivity guiding every LSAT cause and effect reasoning behind the decline in dropout rate. Okay, let's move on to C. C as in the preceding year, more high school students remained in school than dropped out. Alright, there was no illicit shift in scope, certainty, or quantity that particularly stood out, so we read till the end. C is the classic reiterating cause or effect, an often appearing incorrect answer archetype. In this case, C is restating the effect that less pupils quit schooling. It is very attractive and incorrect answer because familiarity breeds comfort. However, what we must determine is whether the morale-boosting program was the only factor behind the decrease. Merely repeating what happened doesn't help us to determine if there really was only one cause per the assumption of exclusivity guiding every LSAT cause and effect reasoning. So the scope is off. Okay, let's move on to B now. B. The morale of students who dropped out of high school had been low even before cut. We can cut here because B is essentially background information that does not help to determine if the morale-boosting program truly was the only factor behind the decrease in dropout rate. That kids who quit high school were depressed even before starting their freshman year cannot help topic-wise determine if there really is only one factor to consider. So the scope is off. Alright, let's move on to a now. A. There was a recession that caused a high level of unemployment in the city. Unlike E and D, which were merely informational, nothing actually happens, A presents an actual fact, as indicated by there was if high school dropouts had less places to go than before, then perhaps it was not only the morale-boosting program that was in play. That alone, raising even the slightest possibility of another factor being a possible cause, is sufficient to be the correct weakener. A is a classic no. One weakener suggests alternative cause. Alright, that's it for today's lesson. I hope you found it useful, and I look forward to broadcasting my content at 7Sage as its LSAT content creator, because I believe JY Ping is the Steve Jobs of LSAT test prep. He started the whole online LSAT learning thing in America. Respect.